Welcome all my chess fans to my first lesson on Udemy. I am chess expert David Luscombe, and I'm going to first of all teach you how to play chess. This is what this lesson is all about. If you look at the chessboard, you will see that it is divided into 64 squares on an 8 by 8 board. Vertically, each set of 8 squares is called a file. So let me illustrate that. This is the A file, the B file, C file, and so on. Horizontally, the board is divided into ranks. This will be the first rank, second rank, and so on up to the 8th rank. It is very important to know this. I will be covering this in more detail in later lessons. As you can see here, each player starts off with a total of 16 pieces. You have 8 pawns, 2 rooks, so let's go ahead and illustrate that. The pawns are on the second rank and you have 8 of them. Then you have a pair of rooks, a pair of knights, a pair of bishops, 1 queen, and 1 king. I'm going to be going over the pawns first, since they are the weakest unit and the easiest to understand. The pawns are only worth 1 point in chess, and that's very important to remember, because it'll help you to understand whether or not you're winning, because you can count up how many points you have versus how many points your opponent has. So a pawn is worth 1 point. All the pawns are placed on the second rank and can only move 1 square forward at a time, except on the first move. On a pawn's first move, it has the option of moving either 1 or 2 squares forward. So for instance, this pawn right here can move either 1 square forward or 2 squares forward on the first move. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So let's move it 1 square forward, and white always moves first in the game of chess. Black will then move his pawn forward either 1 or 2 squares, like so. Alright, let's go ahead and back up. Pawns are the only piece on the chessboard that cannot move or capture backwards. It captures only 1 square diagonally to the left or right. And there also is an additional special rule that applies only to pawns. If a pawn reaches the 8th rank or the final rank, it can turn itself in for a queen, knight, bishop, or a rook. And I'm going to go ahead and illustrate those two concepts real fast. So we looked at d4, and the pawn can only move 1 or 2 squares forward on the first move, and after that it can only move 1 square forward at a time. So let's just say black plays a pawn to e6, then we would see e4 from white, and notice that this pawn now can only move 1 square forward because it has already moved, and now white can capture this pawn and therefore be at material. So that's how you capture with these pawns, and black can now capture back with his pawn. If white pushes up here, black can capture back this way. Alright, so now that we understand how the pawns can capture, I'm going to drag this pawn to the edge of the board over here to illustrate another concept where if the pawn reaches the opponent's first rank, if black reaches this rank with one of his pawns, then he can turn it into a queen, a bishop, a knight, or a rook. And likewise, if white gets his pawn to the back rank, then he can also turn it into another piece, and that's called promotion. So here it is white's turn to move. White's going to play that pawn forward, and now black captures this knight. And he can turn it into a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. Queen is the most powerful, so he goes ahead and does that, and that is called promotion. The next piece that we're going to look at is the knight. Let's look at the knight next. The knight is worth 3 points, which is 3 pawns, and they move in an L shape. They can move both forwards and backwards, and they capture in the exact same way that they move. They move in combinations of 2s and 1s. They can move either 2 squares up or down, with 1 square to the left or right as one move. or one square up or down with two squares to the left or right is one move. So it's combinations of twos and ones. As we can see here, this knight that's highlighted is able to move up two squares and to the left one or to the right one as one move. Now let's just say black would play a move like e5, just moving this pawn forward. White can capture that by moving his knight up two squares and to the left one. Now the same thing would happen if black were to develop his knight out to c6, except here instead of the usual moving up two squares, we're going to move up just one square instead, and then we're going to move to the left two squares to capture this knight. So that's how the knights move and capture in chess. Let's go ahead and look at the bishops next. The bishop is a long-range piece, and like the knight, is also worth 3 points. Let's take a look at how the bishop moves and captures. It moves and captures on these diagonals. So for instance, this bishop here could capture that pawn, and black could do the same. And it can just simply capture all of this material, which is quite a bit of material. Alright, so that is essentially how the bishop moves and captures in chess. It's a long-range piece, and let's go ahead and take a look at the next piece. Now we are going to go over how the rook moves and captures in chess. It is worth a total of 5 points, and it moves as many squares as possible. As long as it's not like a piece blocking its path, it can move as many squares as it wants to, up, down, left, or right. So this rook, for instance, is not able to move to the left because of all these pieces blocking its path. So it can't move that direction, and it cannot move diagonally either, but it can move all the way up the board and capture this other rook. And the same thing for black. Black's rook can't move this way because all these pieces stand in its path, but it can move down here and capture. The rook can capture the knight, can capture the bishop as well, and that illustrates the power of the rook and its potential. Let's go ahead and take a look at the queen next and see how that moves and captures. The queen is worth a total of 9 points and is the most powerful piece on the board. It can move as many squares as it wants to, up, down, left, right, diagonally, all across the board, as long as it's not moving through another piece. So for instance, this white queen here can move all the way over here, can move like this. It's very powerful. There's many different squares that it can move to. Let's move it out here to the right, and at this point white could capture the queen here and trade off the queens, but instead goes after this pawn, and this illustrates just how powerful the queen can be. It can capture a lot of pieces and keep an attack going for a long time. So that is the queen. Let's go ahead and take a look at the last piece, the king, and see what it can do. Although the queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard, and the king is probably one of the weakest, if you lose the king, you lose the entire game. You can lose the queen and be alright, you can lose material and still play on. But if you lose the king, it's checkmate and the game is over. It doesn't matter if you are up material or if you have a better position, the game ends in checkmate. I'm going to illustrate that here in just a minute, but first we're going to go over the moves that the king has and how it can capture. The king can move one square in any direction, diagonally, up, down, left, or right. So it can capture this knight here. The black king can do the same, and now white's king is just going to go after these pawns. Black's king is also going to go after the pawn over here on h2, and both of them capture the remaining pieces. This would end in a draw because there would be insufficient material to win the game. Two kings cannot beat each other because they can't attack each other because they can't put each other in danger. If white were to try to attack black's king, because they have the same attacking ability, white's king would be in danger at the same time that black's king would. So therefore you can't check with a king. You can't attack a king with another king. That's important to know. Now we're going to look at what checkmate looks like. And this position is white's turn to move, and in one move white can win the game by checkmating black's king. Remember that the king is unable to put itself in danger. So the king cannot capture another piece if it would put itself in danger of being captured next turn. In addition to that, if you can take away all the squares that the king has, attack every square that it can possibly move to, and the square that it is on, it will be in checkmate. And the correct answer here is to play the queen out to g2, checkmate. The king cannot capture the queen because it would be in danger of being captured on the next move. The king cannot move either because the queen controls all of the escape squares. So therefore it is checkmate. Let me show you another one of these. In this position is black's turn to move. Do you see how he can checkmate white? In one move black can checkmate white. White's king currently cannot move here because it would be captured by black's king. It can't move here either because it would be captured by the king. And if the king were to move to the other escape square, then the bishop would capture it. So all of the king's escape routes have been blocked off. So all black needs to do is attack white's king on the square that it currently stands on. And the best way to do that is to play queen to h3, attacking the king, and the king has no escape squares, so therefore it is checkmate. Thank you for watching, and I will upload a lot of these puzzles so that you can learn checkmates better, and we will cover this in more detail also in later lessons. This is just an introduction to checkmate to give you a basic idea of how to win the game. There is also a really special rule associated with the king. This is designed to make the king safer, to make it more difficult for your opponent to attack it, and it's a very useful move. It's called castling. Castling is essentially where the king and the rook will swap places. The rook goes on the other side and is there to help the king in case it's ever attacked. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. The king moves over 2 squares to the right, and the rook moves on the other side. Now notice in this position, white cannot castle to the left side of the board because of all of these pieces that are in the way of the king and the rook. The back rank has to be cleared off. There has to be no other pieces between the king and the rook in order for castling to occur. There are some situations where you can no longer castle. For instance, if white were to capture this pawn, attacking the king, and the king takes back, then the king will no longer be able to castle because it is already moved. So if the king has moved, you can't castle. Also, if the rook has moved, then castling no longer works either. So if the rook moves over to g8, if black wanted to castle, he would have to castle to the left side of the board, on the queen side over here, since the rook has already moved. So if either the king or the rook moves, castling cannot happen. Also, castling cannot happen through check. So for instance, if we get a position like this, and it is black's turn and he wants to castle, he cannot castle because if he does, he'll put his king in danger of being captured by this bishop. So you cannot castle into a position where your king would be in danger of being captured on the next move. And you cannot castle through an attack either. that doesn't work out. So let's go ahead and take a look at what castling on the queen side looks like. So black is just looking to get all of these pieces out of the way so that there is nothing between the king and the rook. At this point, black just moves the king over 2 squares and the rook moves over to the other side. That is a very useful maneuver that is designed to help protect the king in chess, and we will get into that in more detail in later lessons. It's just an important maneuver for you to know in order to play chess effectively. There is yet another special rule in chess, and this one is called en passant. It has to deal with the pawns, and it occurs immediately after your opponent, or you, have played a pawn 2 squares forward, and it is right beside another pawn. They have to be right next to each other. And in this position, white can capture, but it has to happen immediately after the pawn moves forward twice, and the pawn has to move forward twice. If it were to move forward, 1 square and then 1 more square, white cannot capture here. In order for en passant to work, the pawn must move forward 2 squares and be right beside a white pawn on that move, and then white can capture. If white were to play a second move, maybe d4 instead, then black could push a pawn and white is no longer able to capture here. It has to happen immediately after the pawn has moved forward twice. And this is a very special rule in dealing with pawns. It doesn't come up that often, but in case it does, it is helpful to know about it. A checkmate in chess is when your opponent's king is under attack and any square that it could escape to is also under attack, and therefore white wins. White wins by checkmate with queen to g2. Now, white could also stalemate black. Stalemate is not a win. It's actually a draw. And a stalemate is when your opponent's king is not under attack, but it has no legal moves to make, and black doesn't have any other moves to make. He can't move a pawn or any other piece. So a stalemate often happens when the king is the only piece left on the board, or he simply cannot move his other pieces because they are immobilized. So in this position, if white were to blunder and play a move like queen to g3, then it's a stalemate. The game ends in a draw. It's black's turn to move, but he has no legal moves to make, and he cannot make an illegal move, so therefore the game is a draw.